Podcasting from the beautiful state of Maine, welcome to another episode of the Learning from Leaders podcast, the show that focuses on identifying and developing the skills and behaviors that will inspire, empower, and compel others to follow your lead. Listen as Patrick's guests talk about the powerful leadership approaches they have identified and developed, which are vital for leading in today's challenging times. These are the same approaches that will positively impact you as a leader too. Learning from Leaders provides the right balance of leadership research with real-world scenarios, making it easy for you to rise above your best. All right, let's start the show.
Hey everybody, I'm Patrick Verno. Thank you for joining me on another episode of Learning from Leaders. And on this episode, we're going to be talking about everything influence, and we're going to do it with Alan Weiss, who is known as the rock star in the consulting world. And I would argue that he's also a rock star in the area of helping people understand influence. And we're going to talk specifically about his book that he co-wrote with Gene Moran, which is called $1 Million Influence: How to Drive Powerful Decisions Through Language, Leverage, and Leadership. And I really loved our conversation and also the content of this book because I think it draws on some areas and nuances around influence that can help anybody, whether you're a leader or selling a product or a service, a parent or in a relationship. We all influence. And his book does a great job of helping to understand how do we do it most effectively. So let's get into it. Alan, I want to thank you for being on the podcast today. I really appreciate this. You're not only the rock star of consulting, but you're also the rock star of writing books. And this is over 60 at this point. I don't know. Do you know exactly what number book?
Something, because there are multiple editions. They're in 15 languages. But I tell people I write so many because I go for volume and not accuracy. So it's easy.
Well, good. So we should have a good time here then. So this book is obviously $1 Million Influence, and it's a topic that I really love. It's one of my favorite ones, and because it's so nuanced, and I think there are so many different directions we can go and learn in this. And I think the book that you've put together really, it introduces some things that I think most don't normally think about when we talk about influence, but are so valuable to really helping people, as you talk about, really driving powerful decisions. And I was wondering first, as we get started, if you could talk about what is your definition of influence?
All right. So first of all, let me just say that this book is co-authored with Gene Moran. And Gene is one of my clients, and he's a former naval captain. And he is a star lobbyist in the most positive sense in Washington, whereby he's won awards for ethical and effective bringing together of public and private interests. So I just want to get it on the record. My definition of influence is where people engage in discussions and negotiations where both feel they've won.
It's that simple.
Well, it's that simple theoretically and conceptually. It's certainly not that simple in practice, which is why we wrote the book.
Which is interesting. I certainly like what you said there about the ethical part, because I think when we often think of influence or sales even, it has a bad connotation to it. And really, you talk about this in a way that is about a preferred outcome, not winning, but a preferred outcome. And I think that's really important, if you could speak to that.
Well, people look at negotiation as a win-lose proposition, and it needn't be that way, but you can't have that mental set going in. So, for example, one of the things that I'm very strong about is that we have musts and we have wants. And so when you're negotiating, when you're influencing, when you're persuading, you never want to give away a must, but you can negotiate away wants. And that way, if both sides do that successfully, they can both feel that they've gained. I'll give you a brief example. When we moved to California many years ago, we lived outside of San Francisco for a while. I said to the realtors, I must have air conditioning. They said, well, you don't really need it here. I said, don't give me that. I have allergies. I need air conditioning. So we go into the first house and there's no air conditioning. And I said, what did I tell you? And she says to me, but look at the view. And the next house, there's no air conditioning. But she says to me, but you're close to schools. So she wanted me to consistently give up a must so she could move that house. That's not the way you deal with people.
Now, you talk about three different things around language, leverage, and leadership as part of this influence process. How important is the language piece?
Language is the most important. Let's take sales and marketing, which I have some expertise in. I teach people that it's all about language because language controls discussions, control relationships, and relationships control business, especially in professional services. So it all starts with language. I have an electronic book called The Martial Arts of Language, and it's about how the simple use and utilization of correct language can change the course of a conversation. so that people feel it's win-win and people feel that no matter what they're paying you, they're getting tremendous value in return. So it's not about maneuvering or manipulation. It is about masterful kinds of influence and what we call $1 million influence.
One of the things that I really appreciated when I read that, and I think before we started here, I told you another one of your books, Value-Based Fees, that I literally just used this yesterday in regards to the appendix there. It helps me there are questions in there in terms of how you ask the questions to create value. And one of the things that you talk about in this book is really trying to replace the word why with 3 other words, with how, what, or who. Why do you think that is so important?
Well, it raises the level of the decision. And so if you feel that the decision takes on more and more strategic importance, you're willing to invest more. But when you get too much down into the weeds, you feel, well, that's really a commodity and a lot of people can do that. So you want to raise that level of decision. One of the things about value-based fees, and you bring it up, is that I advocate against, and I've been doing this since the 90s when I introduced it, against hourly or daily billing. It's unethical because the longer it takes you to help, the more money you get, but a client deserves a fast resolution. So the language I use, when somebody says, well, what's your value basis? What's your fee basis? I say, I get equitable compensation in return for the dramatic return on investment that you earn, that you get. And so when you talk like that, you're partners. And that's how words and language can change the meaning of everything.
When you talk about influence in here as well, you bring up the concept of improv. Again, one of those things that you don't generally see in an influence, but I think is so relevant to this topic.
Well, we have to take a holistic view of our lives and our business. So, for example, my son has spent a part of his career in the theater as an actor, as a coach. And one of the things he did, in fact, we did this together at one point. We put on a workshop on improv. And the reason that attracted me is that one of the principles of improv is you never deny, you only accept. So if somebody says, it's raining here in this taxi, the other partner doesn't say, it's not raining in here. You say, yes, but I expect it might only be the sprinkler system or something like that. So if you're dealing with a client or a prospect, if you don't reject, if you don't deny, and you simply accept what they say, but add to it, you have a much greater chance of converting them. So instead of saying, look, it's not true that people leave organizations. They leave leaders, they leave individuals. Instead of saying it that way, you say, you're quite right, there's a problem with people leaving organizations, but may I suggest to you that part of that problem probably comes from a very few of your leaders. It's just a softer way to include what they said, but add to it.
I actually took an improv class, a series of them, probably 10 years ago. And I will tell you, I found it valuable just in terms of flexibility, of not getting caught up when things don't go the direction you want. It's almost as though you just sort of roll with it. You have an opportunity to sort of be flexible as to what's going on. And I know you stress that.
Well, this is what we commonly call staying in the moment. And when people come in scripted, they have a sales pitch. So that, God almighty, if one other person says elevator pitch to me, I'm going to ask if they're still living in the 1950s. It's absolutely ridiculous. So you stay in the moment and you take the conversation where it seems to be going, but you gently shift it to where you want to go. I call this keeping the boats in the channel, because when I was a kid, I went to the amusement park. You got in these little speedboats. But what really took you around the course was there was a stream. There was a steady sort of torrent that took the boat in the desired direction, and the boat bounced off the sides. So your steering had nothing to do with it. The amusement park kept the boats in the channel. You couldn't take it down the river. And I think we have to keep the boats in the channel in our conversations.
It's interesting along those lines. I don't know if you ever utilized motivational interviewing, but in motivational interviewing, it talks about rolling with resistance. And again, I think very much the same thing. You see where it goes and you become more flexible. And I think that can be really difficult in terms of understanding influence.
Well, you have to have a wide vocabulary and you have to be able to use metaphors and analogies, as I just did with the boats. But you also have to keep in mind that, well, I practice behavioral interviewing, which means, and I'm not doubting that other forms are great, but I'm saying to you that I want to put people in the actual situation and see how they respond rather than just get an intellectual response. So I would say to them, if you found out your boss unequivocally was cheating on expenses, what would you do? And if the person says to me, it depends how much, that tells me one thing. If they say to me, I'd approach the boss and say, look, is this true? Because some of us know about it. That's another thing entirely. And so I find that the kind of discussion you have with people that puts them in a certain situation which they have to respond to in an emotional sense tells you a lot about them.
So I'm going to sort of roll in this direction then when you talk about the intellectual component, because I think that's with a lot of things, right? The trainings that we create for individuals, that intellectually, I think a lot of this stuff can be easy. It's the application of it that I think becomes difficult.
You couldn't be more correct, because, see, logic makes us think and emotion makes us act. So it's one thing to play chess and say King's Rook to King's Rook 3. It's another to play rugby. And you've got to have some contact support here, because otherwise it's too easy to agree intellectually and still not make a move. But if you're emotionally attached, for example, instead of saying, look, how would you like to reduce your time on the job every week from the 60 hours you're putting into 50 hours? That's one thing. And anybody's going to say, oh, that would be very useful. But if you were to say, how'd you like to spend more time with your family? That's an emotional connection. And again, it's a question of how you apply language. But as you can see, it makes all the difference. I'm suggesting the exact same thing, the exact same improvement, but one is intellectual and one is emotional.
This book obviously is in the 60s somewhere in terms of the number that's been published. Is there a reason why now? And is it different in regards to since COVID? Do you think influence is different how we approach it today versus pre-COVID, or I call it now?
Let me say two things. The first is that we tend not to realize how much remote work we were doing before COVID. I mean, before Zoom, there was Skype, which practically no one talks about anymore, right? But Skype started this, and then Zoom and all this kind of go-to-meeting and all this kind of thing. We did a lot of remote work, all of us, because it was cheaper and it was easier, and you didn't have to go through TSA and prove that you were innocent, otherwise you're guilty, right? We were doing that all along. COVID just magnified our need for it. But I'll tell you something else now in terms of influence. If people keep talking about post-COVID and the new normal, they're going to be seen as relics. Okay, we're through with that. Yeah, there'll be a COVID surge and people are mostly vaccinated and it'll be like getting the flu. But the fact is that there is no new normal. There is no return to normal. In fact, I've actually trademarked the phrase no normal. And we have to get used to the fact there's no normal anymore. And that disruption and volatility, which ought to be the name of a law firm, right, are really offensive weapons and not something to be afraid of, because those of us who are successful have been practicing disruption and volatility forever. And that's how you gain influence in the workplace and elsewhere, because you're seen as a positively disruptive force. So when I introduced in the 90s value-based fees, as you pointed out, for consulting, what is that, 30 years ago, I have today continuing the strongest solo consulting brand in the world. And that's the power of language and disruption and so forth.
As it relates to influence, you even talk about the Pareto principle, really, this 80-20 rule in terms of how good do you need to be or effective to really influence people?
Well, my feeling is that when you're 80% ready, you move, because the final 20% you put into a speech, the audience doesn't appreciate. The final 20% you put in a book, the audience doesn't even read. The final 20% you put in preparing for a business meeting, the other party doesn't even know it's there. And so we spend so much time pursuing perfection that we kill excellence. Consequently, when you're 80% ready, move, and you make the rest of the corrections mid-course. I've never started a consulting project. I've never started a negotiation. I've never started a coaching project with all the information I need. And a lot of the information you've gathered is wrong anyway.
You talk about emotional intelligence as being important. Again, another one of those, we talked about improv earlier. I think EI, EQ is another one of those things that oftentimes gets overlooked in its importance to being able to influence. I was wondering if you could talk to that.
I wrote another book called The Modern Trusted Advisor with another one of my clients, Nancy McKay, and who runs a big coaching advisory business. And what I found is that no matter what you call it, emotional intelligence, emotional IQ, whatever it is, I really would rather think of sympathy and empathy. So empathy is understanding what the other person feels, putting yourself in their shoes. Sympathy is commiserating with them, is feeling pity for them or regret. Because I do so much coaching at high levels, I believe in tough love. And tough love is empathy without the sympathy. In other words, I know where you are, I can help you, but I'm not sitting here to help you feel sorry for yourself. And wielding influence is about helping people move forward and improve and get positive things out of any kind of negotiation. It's not about saying to them, well, you're at a disadvantage here. Yeah, this hasn't worked in the past. It's about a much more positive viewpoint.
Back in 2008 or 2009, when I first got into consulting, I had left the pharmaceutical industry. I'd been in there for about 15 years and was involved in sales and sales training. And I went back to meet with a manager after going through a director of sales, after going through a coaching program and also a licensing program on emotional intelligence. And when I first read about emotional intelligence, I thought all this seemed to be to me was a sales model. It was following a sales model in terms of understanding the situation you're in. I will never forget this. When I went and had my meeting with this director of sales in New Jersey, he said, I want to talk about really any topics you want to talk about in terms of coming into and doing training, except for that EIBS. That was the only thing he didn't want to talk to. And I thought, boy, this is somebody that really doesn't understand how important this is.
Let me tell you something. I had major consulting assignments with about 5 pharma companies, and the biggest by far was Merck, with whom I worked for 12 years. And during that period, when America's most admired company 5 times in a row, their sales force had all kinds of prizes and accolades. And they used a lot of what we're talking about, emotional intelligence and empathy and so forth, because they were dealing with doctors. They were dealing with medical professionals. Then, when everything shifted in healthcare in the States, and suddenly you weren't selling to doctors, you were selling to the acquisitions people down in the basement, none of that stuff mattered anymore. Yeah. And overnight, Merck had this tremendous investment. The sales force was no longer relevant because those people in the basement just wanted the best deals on paper. They didn't care about relationships or anything else. They were paid to drive down prices. And so that's how critical these things can be applied correctly or incorrectly.
Yeah. And not to go down a different path here, that continues to happen if you look at the way healthcare is now and how restricted it is to allowing reps and people in. There's even less relevance to it.
That's true. But look at any profession. I mean, if you look at car dealerships, in some dealerships, you walk in, the salesperson said, we have a sale only for the next 2 weeks on this model. You get returns and credits from the manufacturer and so on. Others walk up to you and say, it's very nice to meet you. What brings you to our place today? Tell me about your objectives. Do you have a family? And so they're trying to understand what this person's looking for. And then talk about an emotional attachment. They don't tell you about the engine displacement, and they don't tell you about the wear and tear on the tires. They say, why don't you take the car for a test drive? And so you go out and you have this emotional experience. You bring the car back and you say, I like this car. And then the salesperson says, you look really cool in that car. I do. I look cool? Yeah. In fact, there's a car around the corner. It's probably out of your price range, but you look even cooler. And the customer says, well, can't hurt to test drive it. That's how you sell cars today.
So you seem to touch on the art versus the science. Clearly an important difference to understand between art and science.
You're exactly right. And the future of sales is evangelism. The future of sales is peer-to-peer reference. And if you think of it, that's what occurs almost all the time now. We just don't recognize it. In other words, if I want a good realtor, I respect you and I say, who to use for a realtor? Who to use for a pediatrician? What's a good vacation spot? And you help me because we're peers, we're colleagues. Yeah. You ask me the same questions. And so that's really the future of sales. Advertising doesn't do it anymore. And in fact, newspapers, I've had a lot of newspaper clients. They're in tremendous jeopardy right now because they're losing about 10,000 newspapers a day in the United States. And if the auto people pull their ads, it's not going to be tenable at all because they're the major advertisers. The second thing is that these influencers and endorsements, like who's the guy who does the Lincoln, McConaughey? Oh, yeah. I mean, does anyone believe McConaughey really drives a Lincoln? Does anyone believe he's not doing this for $5 million? And so that kind of stuff is just nonsense. You want to fire your ad firm right there. The key is the kind of influence that takes place among peers. And what I tell my clients is if you really want to boost your sales at virtually no cost, have your very best customers talk to your second best customers because your second best customers already love you. You just want to drive them up to that top level. It's a huge margin increase. And so that's the art of it today. The science of advertising, whether it's tactical or strategic, doesn't matter.
It's interesting, Alan, as you talk about that, I think about this from a standpoint of employee engagement and how things have changed from a social media standpoint, right? 20 years ago, you didn't know what companies if you're on the East Coast, what companies on the West Coast were doing, how employees were treated and what was going on. But now there's so much openness in terms of experience and what's going on. And I think that drives some of this employee or desire for it.
Well, let's look at this as disruption because the best way and the cheapest way to get new employees today, which is desperately needed, right? Good quality new employees because of staffing problems, is to use your greatest resource, which is your current employee. And your current employees are the best ambassadors for your company if they're happy. And the motivation today in the workplace is about applying as many of your talents as you can and getting recognized for it. It's not about money. If you give an unhappy employee more money, you have a wealthier, unhappy employee. So if you can use your people as ambassadors, they'll bring in people with no executive search cost, with no pricing and so forth and so on. So you're absolutely right about that. But companies don't do enough to encourage that.
It's amazing to me, and I spending time in that space of thinking of the employees as your first customers, that if you make them happy, they do the selling for you, right? Because who doesn't want to go and say, oh, I work for this company. You should come over here. You would love it here.
You tell me an organization that has unhappy employees and happy customers. That doesn't exist.
Totally.
Look at the difference in the U.S. between JetBlue and American. JetBlue, every flight is positive. Everybody's happy. They love the company. American, it's a 50-50 chance you're either going to be treated well or you're going to be treated like crap. It depends upon how those people feel about the company that day. So it's really important to understand that you need to use these natural resources that you have to your benefit. And again, that's a question of influence because these people who work for you are talking to their peers who could be working for you.
Right. This topic of influence, I think, is so relevant, right? Just to leadership in and of itself, right? That understanding how to influence those people around you.
The biggest source of new business in professional services is referral business. And so you should be able to talk to your buyer, who's a peer of you, to get names of his or her peers who will become future peers for you. And that is the cheapest, most effective way to get new business. But so many people don't do it because they're afraid of rejection, and they don't see themselves as peers of the buyer. They see themselves as subordinates.
Yeah. Which, to that point, right, you often refer to them as, right, business counterparts and not as a prospect, so to speak. Even that language, to me, as I read that, it has a different feel to it, right? When it's a counterpart, you're showing up differently.
Listen, I don't care if you walk in an office that's 500 square feet and that person is making $7 million a year and has a budget of $45 million and has 200 people working for them. The point is that you are a peer because you're an expert in your area. And if they didn't need your help, they wouldn't be talking to you. And so one of the first questions I ask a prospect when I meet them is, what prompted you to put time aside to meet with me today? And all of a sudden, I've set the agenda and we're peers.
Yeah, it's a great question. On a more technical side, you talk about a couple of different levels of the process in terms of who you're going to interact with. The gatekeeper, I think probably most are familiar with, right, in a selling situation. But you also talk about the decision influencer. And I was wondering if you could talk about, what does that mean? Who is a decision influencer?
Well, in a small business, a closely held business, if there's a partner or spouse, it's that person. And if the owner of the business says to you, well, my partner's not really involved, I never believe that, because over the dinner table or over a drink, they're going to be talking about this strange person that the owner met. And I tell the owner all the time, listen, we should interact, the three of us, because you're going to be asked questions you can't answer. Secondly, in a publicly held business or a larger business, you have people, and as you said, let's put aside the gatekeeper whose job they see is to protect the buyer. But you have people the buyer respects because they've always given them good advice. Or the buyer knows, unlike a lot of subordinates, this person isn't afraid to just tell what's on his or her mind. And so you have to understand that you can get in a conversation with the buyer who those folks are. For example, I need to talk to my R&D guy because I really want to get his opinion. And here's a surprise. A lot of times it's the assistant or the secretary. And they'll say, well, isn't this the fourth person like this who's come to? And they'll say, yes, but this person's different. So it's important to sort of get a feel for the environment and who's who, especially if you have trouble reaching the buyer directly. You have to work through these other means. I'll tell you a bizarre incident like this. When my very first book came out in '88, and I wrote that one with a partner. It's called The Innovation Formula. It's still on Amazon. I think it's $10 today. When this book first came out in hardcover, my partner arranged for a couple hundred of them to get a cover, a dust jacket that looked like a tuxedo. And in the pocket of the tuxedo was a rose, a real rose. And he had messengers go around Manhattan, and they delivered these to these secretaries. And the note said, the book is for your boss, the rose is for you, because the secretaries were almost universally female. I said, you can never get away with this, but back then you could do it. And he got some appointments that way.
What about the enabler? Who is the enabler?
There are people who make things happen because they can really drive things. My contention is that today, more than ever, speed is as important as content. That's my 80% move rule. So speed is as important as content. So if you find people who love to take the lead, love to get things done, love to have the limelight, and will make their boss look good, those become your allies. Most people are threatened by change. They're threatened by the journey, really. And the future always looks bright, but it's how to get there that gives them angst, gives them heartburn. And so they're very conservative, very cautious. They feel threatened. But there are some of these people who say, let's start yesterday. Let's get there first. And those people give you a lot of added velocity to get the buyer to say, okay, maybe it's time to go.
In the pharmaceutical industry, they look at prescribing habits of physicians, and you would have what's called early adopters. Those are the ones that they got out in front of things, I think, to what you're talking about here. They didn't wait. They sort of did their own legwork up front, and they wanted to be out on the front lines of things.
You're exactly right. And then let's just take the insurance business, where I used to do a lot of work. Some insurance companies had both captive agents, but also independent agents. Prudential did this at the time. I don't know if they still do. But the captive agents sort of followed the company marches and sang the company fight song. But the independent agents, who could work with anybody, if they sniffed something that was really high potential, they went after it like a jet. And when they called the home office and said, I need more help here, I need a faster response here, they got it, because these guys got major corporate insurance clients to move.
I want to take a step back, though, when we were talking about the gatekeeper, because even though we sort of glossed over it, my guess is a lot of people you talk about, there are some people that can't say yes, but they can certainly say no. And I think the gatekeeper is one of those, right? If they're not respected and treated properly, they can certainly create a lot of problems.
Well, you have to go beyond that even, because no gatekeeper can say yes. They have no budget. And so they can't approve a thing. Giving a proposal to a gatekeeper is the equivalent of just throwing it out the window. You might as well let it blow away. And they can say no because they have the power not to introduce you to anybody else. Basically, there are three ways to deal with a gatekeeper. The first way is give them, and this is about influence, give them an incentive to be part of the success and say, look, you represent the culture of the organization. I represent some outside fresh air so you don't breathe your own exhaust. Why don't we approach your boss together and make this your credit as well? So the second is guile, is a real art form, which is ethically, I can't give you any proposal or cite any fees without hearing the expectation from your buyer, who has the fiduciary responsibility to invest, from her or his lips. And the third way is just to blow up the gatekeeper, because you're not going to get anywhere anyway if they keep resisting. You say, look, I know who the buyer is, so I'm going to approach them directly. Should I mention our conversation or not? So those are the three ways you either enlist the aid of a gatekeeper or you get through them. But I advise people, do not spend a lot of time with them, because the more time you spend, the less chance you have. I've never waited a long time and had better news. Nobody ever said to me, Alan, just wait a quarter and we'll double your fee. No one's ever said that.
But along those lines, I think from the standpoint of respecting them, if you don't, and it's observed that you don't maybe just give them proper respect, there's a relationship they have with the buyer, that the buyer looks and says, this person is not a good person based on how they treat somebody that they think is subordinate to them.
That's why the first step is to try to enlist them in their own self-interest to join you in this. But if that's not successful, don't waste a whole lot of, we're not talking about 4 meetings here. Another problem you have here is that if you spend a lot of time with the gatekeeper, even if the gatekeeper finally introduces you, you are recognized as someone at their level, not at the buyer's level. So it's hard to be a partner to somebody who's been dealing 7 levels down. It's another problem.
Now, along those lines, you talk about getting your house in order, right? Before you go and sell to the actual buyer. What does that process look like? Because again, I think that's a really important component of it, especially if you're enthusiastic, you think you have the solution here and you shoot your bullets before you should.
Well, you're right. In other words, that's why you can't stick to a script. That's why you have to stay in the moment. So for example, when you arrive at a site, does the buyer come out and meet you personally and take you back to the office? Or does the buyer send an assistant to come get you? Does the buyer offer you coffee and maybe go to the cafeteria with you? Or does the buyer simply sit down and say, what can I do for you? Does the office look like a museum with photographs and memorabilia and awards? Or does the office look like the bridge of a battleship where everything is in arm's reach and ready to fire? And so you don't have to do a whole lot of advanced homework. If you're good at simply absorbing the environment, you can tell very quickly what kind of personality you're dealing with. Of course, you can also take a look at the recent results of the company, especially if it's publicly held. And you can also take a look today more than ever on Google and so forth as to what the CEO, how he might have been or she might have been interviewed, what they might have written themselves, and where they came from before this.
So again, when I hear you talk about that stuff too, I think back to emotional intelligence or social intelligence. It's about understanding, reading your environment or reading your audience. So the more effective you are at that, what's around you, right? In terms of what's on the walls, and that's old stuff, but I think it's very relevant to reading who your audience is.
Well, I agree completely with your description. My problem with emotional intelligence is that not a lot of people know what the heck it means. And so it's just thrown around there, like the Great Resignation or something. Great Resignation is an existential jailbreak. And people talk about quietly quitting. Well, what about quietly firing? Because you don't want to just replace bodies. It's an opportunity to cleanse. So that's what I mean by volatility and disruption being positive. So when you gloss, not you, but when anybody glosses over these important emotional traits you're talking about by calling it EQ, it sort of reduces it to the intellectual exercise and not the important emotional exercise.
I do think that's a great point. Maybe that's part of the problem why so many resist it, because they don't appreciate really what's involved in it. Because when you do, it has a whole different, it's a strength and not this sort of fluffy snowflake type of approach that you take.
You take the whole popular psychology movement of the last decade and positive self-talk, which Marty Seligman over at Sylvania really popularized with learned optimism. I had him as a guest at one of my experiences, a convention. If you just talk about positive self-talk, it's sort of this vague principle. But if you say, listen, stop starting your sentences with I'm struggling or I'm having a problem, and start your sentences with I've got a challenge I'd like to. When you can point out those specifics, it becomes much more emotional. And when you give people these kind of help to understand how to improve themselves and their self-image, that's really useful. But if you just say this to people, well, you have low self-esteem, that's not really helpful.
When I hear you talk about that too, I think of another thing that you talk about in the book, and I see it quite often, is around confirmation bias, right? We answer the questions that we ask almost. If I think a certain thing, or why am I not good at this? What do? I generally think of all of the evidence that will back up why my thought on this is accurate.
Well, the problem is that social media today is a cesspool of confirmation bias. And so people only read and listen to what they originally believe and agree with. They will not read opposing views. And it's why the country is so polarized right now. Everybody thinks they're on some higher moral ground. And it's easier to believe you're on a higher moral ground than really try to improve your position. So I think it's a tremendous difficulty. We need to be open to all points of views. And on social media in particular, the fact is you can have an opinion, but an opinion is not a fact. And we need to separate that.
Yeah. When I hear you talk about that, I immediately go to listening, right? Our inability to really listen to other viewpoints is, I think we've gone from not do we not listen to understand. And it used to be in sales, it was you would have people that listen to respond. I'm just going to wait till you finish, and then I'm going to give you my point of view. And I think we've devolved even more that we've gone to listening to undermine people. You're stupid. You don't know what you're talking about, without really taking a step back and listening from a standpoint of curiosity. And I think from an influence standpoint, right, to be able to listen with curiosity allows us to maybe hear things that we wouldn't necessarily do if we went in with just our own opinion.
Well, it's insufficient for me to be right. You also have to be wrong. That's what we've come to. And strangely enough, you can mention one word that immediately divides people. So it's abortion, it's immigration, it's climate. I can go on. And as soon as the one word is raised, bang, people go in two different directions. Right. There's no discussion anymore.
Which I think it's where we are today.
No, it's reflected in the media, and it's reflected in our universities. Of all places, this is where free speech is least respected today.
As it relates to your book, is there anything in particular that you've found is the most challenging aspect of this for somebody to be able to become more effective at?
Are you talking about wielding influence?
Of influence, yeah.
I think that there are a couple of challenges. I think in no special order, one of them is that you have to establish a relationship. You have to establish some basic trust so that the other person isn't coming from the position of, okay, I've dealt with people like this before and they're just going to try to cheat me, right? So you've got to develop some trust. And that means that you also have to be sensitive to and emotionally committed to a joint win. You might not get everything you want, but you can both preserve your musts, as I mentioned earlier. I think the final thing is this. You're not always going to be successful. And so don't regard yourself as lousy at influence or lousy at conflict resolution or whatever, just because it didn't work in this occasion. And so what I tell people is isolate negatives, generalize positives. So if I didn't get very far with you today, I'm not going to say, God, I'm just lousy at trying to influence people. I'm going to say, today, at this time, in this place, with this person, I wasn't successful. If I am successful in influencing you, I'm not going to say, oh, I got lucky. I'm going to say, I've turned into quite a brilliant influencer. And it's really, that's again, a matter of self-talk. And it's a matter of personal self-esteem in terms of how you explain with positive self-talk how well you're doing. But you accommodate the fact that you're not going to bat 1,000. Nobody does.
Yeah. Or that you're the right fit all the time, right? That you don't try and force something. They say, this is not a customer that really is a good customer for me, or a good partnership to have. It won't go well. And I think there's insight to be able to understand, like, this is not.
I think that's true. I don't operate on the basis that the other person is damaged. I always think the other person is as healthy as I am, unless they show me differently. And about 90% of the time, I'm right. The other person isn't damaged, and we can have a discussion. But 10% of the time, you will find somebody who is damaged, who is biased, who is irrational. And in that case, you can never fight irrationality with rationality, and you're better off getting out of there.
Alan, thank you so much for this conversation around influence. Is one that I think is one we can always improve on. I really appreciated your perspective. I have great respect for you. As I mentioned, I haven't read 65 of your books, but I've enjoyed the ones that I've read. They're extremely valuable.
Well, I appreciate it deeply. I really enjoyed this. I always like these discussions, and it's very kind of you to invite me.
Yeah, thanks so much. Wishing you all the best.
Take care.
Take care. Thank you so much for taking the time to listen to my podcast. If you found the guests and topics on my show and my perspectives on the show to be valuable to your own personal growth or to the growth of your team, I would love the opportunity to have a discussion with you on how the models, the approaches, and the book that I've published, The Leadership Bridge, how to engage your employees and drive organizational excellence, can help you and your organization as well. If you're interested, you can reach out to me at patrick@emeryleadershipgroup.com, and that's EMERY leadershipgroup.com. And let's explore how my unique models and approaches can help you and your team or your organization to rise above your best.
Thanks so much for listening to this episode of the Learning from Leaders podcast. If you've enjoyed the show, please feel free to rate, review, and subscribe on your preferred podcast listening platform. We really appreciate that effort. Until next time, keep rising above your best as a leader.